In 1960, a young filmmaker called Roger Corman, who specialised in low-budget B-movies, pitched a new film to American International Pictures. He wanted to make an adaptation of a short story by one of his favourite horror authors, Edgar Allan Poe, called The Fall of the House of Usher. At first, the producers, who were keen to create monster movies with Corman, were reluctant, noting that there was no monster in Fall of the House of Usher, to which Corman, thinking quickly on his feet, replied, "The house is the monster."
For hundreds of years, evil thoughts and evil deeds have been committed within these walls. The house itself is evil now.
House of Usher was greenlit. It starred Vincent Price and was shot on a soundstage across 15 days for $300,000, and it went on to make over $1 million on release. Off the back of that success, American International Pictures produced a series of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations over the next few years, including The Raven, Tales of Terror, The Mask of the Red Death, and of course, The Pit and the Pendulum.
You are about to enter hell, Bartholomew. Hell!
The combination of Poe's short stories, Corman's filmmaking, and Vincent Price's fun but haunting performances felt like a match made in horror heaven. All films perfectly captured the eerie queasiness of Poe's writing, mixing classic gothic horror with a more experimental sensibility. The films solidified Vincent Price's reputation as a true legend of horror, and Roger Corman's reputation as one of the most influential and successful low-budget filmmakers of all time. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss House of Usher and The Pit and the Pendulum. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munter, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season, exploring the evolution of home invasion horror, and this is part 8. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we're going to be talking all things Roger Corman and Edgar Allan Poe. Later on in this episode, I will be joined by friend of the pod, Axelle Carolyn, to discuss Pit and the Pendulum and the House of Usher in spoilerific detail. But first, I thought as this season is the first time we're really delving into the works of Edgar Allan Poe, it was time to have a little chat about Poe as a writer and one of the most important figures in horror. So joining me for a bit of background info on Edgar Allan Poe, I've got my resident ghost story aficionado. He is an actor, writer, director, and host of the Ghost Story Book Club, and he doesn't like to be left waiting out in the cold. Better let him in. Adam Robinson, hello.
Hello, Mike. Thanks for having me back.
So lovely to have you back. How have you been?
Oh, really well. Really well, you know, ploughing on with everything. Feels like it's been a while, though, because I think the last time I spoke to you was for Dracula, wasn't it?
Was it? It has been a while.
Is that right? Oh,
yeah.
We chatted in the interim. We've seen each other loads in person.
Well, we've seen each other a lot, and I really enjoyed coming to see a lot of your shows that you were doing over the sort of Christmas-winter period. Obviously, A Christmas Carol, which was incredible, and then Haunted as well, which was absolutely incredible and very scary as well. Can I just say,
man. Yeah,
very creepy.
It's funny that because this is the one that was supposed to be a slightly smaller project, right? It was supposed to be a project between a couple of other projects, and it was 2 classic ghost stories, and we put loads of effort into it, and I was really excited about taking it on the road. But I don't know, somehow it felt like a smaller project. But actually, the response that we've had to Haunted has been one of the best responses we've had to anything. And loads of people have said that it was scary. And of all the shows that I've ever toured, we've had the most people walking out because they were frightened.
I love that.
Yeah,
amazing.
And it was mostly young people, and we do warn people ahead of time that we don't recommend people under the age of like 12 to come. But yeah, we've had a few people walking out in tears, which is
that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Yeah, and I wonder if it's like you said, it's had such a good response, but I wonder if that's just because it's a bit like, I found this with the podcast even, it's just that cumulative effect, right, of more and more people are now aware of your work, and those audiences just slowly grow in size, don't they? I think
they do, and they definitely do, and it's really nice to go to places we've been to a few times before. We went to the Duke's in Lancaster, and it was a Tuesday night in February, so I was really worried about it. Actually, it was the last day of January, and it was a Tuesday night, so I was really worried about it, thinking, nobody goes to the theatre in January, it's really difficult to get audiences typically. But we sold out. We sold out for 2 nights in this really brilliant 300-plus seater space, and there were people standing. They've got some standing room, so we had people standing as well. So yeah, it's that brilliant thing. I also think, in terms of the show, you'll know yourself. The longer you do something, you get better at it. You start to understand what it is that you're doing more, what the offer is that you're making to your audience, and I think that Haunted sort of has this, as you said, this accumulation of the experience of doing it a lot, and But it was I was so touched that you guys came. I told you at the time, but the show wasn't in London; it was just outside of London, and I was so touched that you all came. As a
we love
big
it.
Gang, honestly.
I love it. We all we love to make these little trips out to come and see Adam's shows. We've done this a few times actually, haven't we? Like a group of us went to Harrogate to see you, who was it? It was me and Rihanna and Becky Dark and her husband and a couple of other people that came out to Walton on Thames, wasn't it? Yeah,
and Laura,
lovely.
who's been on your podcast for the first
time recently. Laura Parashon. Exactly.
And Louise, of course, lovely Louise was
Louise
there.
Blaine was there. There was a nice little group of us.
It was a big old gang. It really was.
And of
Evolution
course,
of Horror All Stars.
And of course, what happens then is alcohol follows.
Yes.
And
we did
is the way.
Go.
When we get all of us together, there's this thing that happens where I think, because we're all having such a lovely time, none of us ever want to go home, and so it's like, right, where can we go next? What can we drink next? Because we don't want to call it a night ever, do we? This is the thing.
I have to book off the day after off. I have to take it off work when I see you, and it is sheer joy. It's just there's always that thing, and we have this little jokey catchphrase, don't we? Which is, should we have one more?
Yeah, one more.
Everyone,
yeah, absolute nightmare, but it's great. It's worth it. It's worth it. So speaking of spooky ghost stories, we've spoken about a lot of ghost stories and authors together on the podcast, but we're talking this week about Edgar Allan Poe. And I thought this was a good chance just to kind of, I guess, kind of introduce people a little bit to the world of Edgar Allan Poe. Obviously, he is like one of those very famous names, but people might not necessarily have read a lot of his stuff or seen works based on his stuff. So I just wanted to kind of chat to you a little bit about him, first of all. Like, what's your sort of history with Poe? Do you remember when you first kind of came to his work or his stories?
I do. I think the first time I encountered Poe properly was when I was at college. And I remember getting a collection of his stories out of the library. And I think it was the Tales of the Grotesque and the Arabesque, which is his sort of most famous collection, and reading things like The Telltale Heart, reading The Raven, The Black Cat, and things like that became and remain, some of my absolute favourite short Gothic stories. And I was aware of his name, I think, from a Beatles song he's mentioned in I Am the Walrus.
Yes, that is exactly how I first heard about him, I think. Yeah,
he's got one of those cool, it's a really great name. And you have to spell it right, because people get cross at you if you get it's Alan rather than Allen.
Yes, that's
as
right.
a name. People get cross when I think I've posted sort of episodes of my podcast previously, and people get cross when you get there.
Absolutely, I spell it wrong 100% of the time.
I do. The first time I write it down, I always stick an E in there every single time. Yeah. But so that was it. And when I went to uni, I did a course on death in the 19th century in American literature, and did a lot of stuff about Poe. Kind of, managed to dive into some of his works again, and did an essay which I'll try to mention a little bit in terms of the content later, but I won't go into depth. About the idea of Poe's attempts at capturing death and describing death, and how that linked with the rising technology of photography at the time, so maybe I'll bring it up in a bit. So yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm a Poe scholar purely, but I really enjoy stuff, and I think it's impossible to ignore him if you're interested in Gothic literature.
Yeah,
it's impossible to ignore him, and perhaps even to overstate how important he is to particularly American Gothic, I think.
Yeah, 100%. So let me just start off just by the basics, really, of asking you a little bit about the man and his work.
Yeah.
You know, how would you describe Edgar Allan Poe and the sorts of stories he wrote?
I think possibly the fairest way to describe his work is as Gothic romanticism, and romanticism in the sense that it, you know, the works are bound up with feeling and emotion rather than, you know, it being concerned with romantic love per se. So Gothic romanticism, I think, is possibly one of the best ways to describe his work. But you know, the other thing is that you've got elements of science fiction, you've got adventure, you've got some historical fiction, although not always reliably accurate historical fiction. It should be said.
Yes.
But he was a writer of short fiction, you know, known very much for helping to popularize short fiction and these sort of lyrical dark poems as well. And he was writing from the age of 14. He was sort of putting things down on paper from the age of 14, and I think his first collection was published in 1827, and he kept writing and putting things down on the page right up until his death in 1849. So he sort of was a lifetime writer in that respect. But I understand it. He wasn't actually. He was more famous really for his literary criticism, certainly in the early part of his career, than he was for his fiction and poetry. And I believe that he didn't actually make all that much money from his literary fiction and poetry while he was alive, you know.
Interesting, yeah.
But yeah, no, and a very interesting biography. I mean, we could talk for hours and hours and hours, which we're not going to do, obviously. But he had a really, really interesting life, which was very tumultuous in lots of ways. You know, his father abandoned the family when he was very young, I think 2, and his mum died soon afterwards, and had a very spiky and complicated relationship with his adopted father, which was that was a man called John Allan, which is where he gets the Allan part of his name from. And he was, you know, he had problems with debt and drinking and gambling, and he had all these difficulties. And one of the things that's kind of often mentioned about Poe is that he married his first cousin.
Yes,
and she was
very young,
she was 13,
right?
Yeah, 13. And I believe the public marriage or the public ceremony, or it was all made official, I think, when she was 14 and he was 27. So yeah. It's, I don't know. I mean, I scribbled down this quote from Wikipedia, which says biographers disagree as to the nature of the couple's relationship. Though their marriage was loving, some biographers suggest that they viewed one another more like brother and sister. But I don't know. I mean, it's really hard, I think, in 2023 to get past the fact that a 27-year-old man married a 14-year-old girl. So it certainly makes me feel uncomfortable and uneasy. And
how much of his private life and his personal life do you think fed into the stories that he told? You know, like, he was around when a lot of people famously around him were dying of diseases like TB, right? Am I right in thinking? And you know, the idea of kind of death and disease and the kind of fascination with that does obviously feed into his work, doesn't it, I think?
Totally. So a lot of people around him died. You know, his wife died when I think she was 24, maybe in 1847. She died of TB, as you said. I think his mum died of TB as well, and he had his adopted mother. She passed away as well, and his brother died, I think, with complications related to alcohol, I believe. But yeah, definitely. I mean, the idea of death and something that comes up in Poe a lot is the idea of this. I guess this contrast between the physical and the metaphysical aspects of death. This sort of paradox between sort of dead and alive. And he seemed really interested in capturing both death, but also life in a sort of standstill, life sort of captured in a moment, life as a snapshot. If you think about there's that story, the facts in the case of M. Valdemar. That is literally about somebody being caught in a mesmeric trance at the point of death and being sort of denied the freedom to be released into death. There's a story called The Oval Portrait, where it's about a man who finds this portrait of a woman in an oval frame, and at the end of the story, we hear about this artist shouting out, "This indeed is life itself," and then he looks at his subject and realizes that his subject is dead. So there's a lot of stuff in Poe about what death is, and he seemed to be very interested in trying to get down on the page the mysteries, the uncanniness, as we might refer to it today, of the dead body, of what that is, a body without that vitality. What is that, And I found it really interesting that after his wife, Virginia, died, Poe commissioned, because he realized he didn't have a likeness of her, so he commissioned somebody to create a watercolor of her. So the only image we have of her that exists is, in fact, a watercolor that was created post-mortem. Now, that in itself isn't particularly, I don't think, unusual at the time, because things like that and photography weren't as readily available to us, so you wouldn't necessarily just have a portrait of a loved one knocking about. But what I think is interesting is that prior to that, you have things like the oval portrait, as I've just described, and there's a bunch of other stories that came before her death, which are about capturing the body post-mortem. The thing that I mentioned earlier very briefly about his interest in photography, Poe wrote an essay on the daguerreotype, or the daguerreotype, or the daguerreotype, depending on how you pronounce it, which is an early form of photography. And he said, and I've got a quote here, he said that the daguerreotype must undoubtedly be regarded as the most important and perhaps the most extraordinary triumph of modern science, end quote. So the interesting thing for me is that, firstly, that this bit of technology was used quite prolifically to capture people, loved ones, post-mortem, which may seem quite ghoulish to us, but again, the historical context is that you wouldn't have snapshots of your family, and if someone died, that would be the only way for you to commemorate them as an image. But aside from that, I think there was something, perhaps, and this is absolutely my speculation, but there was perhaps something about the ability of that early method of photography to capture the stillness, the lifelessness of a corpse, that captured Poe's imagination, because it is there in lots of his writing.
Yes. That kind of like you said, it's that kind of thin veil between life and death, right? There seems to be a lot of that recurring in his stuff, And what about the sorts of stories that he told then? If we were to sort of reduce this to, a simple kind of subgenre, for example, as we like to do on this podcast, what would you say that he told, like traditional kind of ghost stories, or was there something else?
I think you struggle to find straight ghost stories in Poe, actually. There are a couple that would pass as a ghost story, and in fact I had the brilliant Mary Wilde on my podcast, the Ghost Story Book Club, and we talked about The Raven and we talked about The Telltale Heart, both kind of slightly to a certain extent through the lens of them being ghost stories. But he didn't write what we would consider the classic ghost stories as we understand it today. I think definitely gothic is a very slightly lazy way of describing his work, but he dabbled in body horror. There are, of course, elements of romanticism in there. As I mentioned before, there's science fiction going on in there, but I think they are just good old-fashioned grotesque horror stories. And the other thing that I think that he is, of course, credited with is inventing the detective story. So The Murders in the Rue Morgue is supposed to be the first example of a modern detective story. So we have that as well in his work. So I always think, when I think of Poe, I think of sort of very raw, very grotesque, very, very much, preoccupied with the mind and the body, and the sort of intersections and the way those two things come together. It is quite hard to neatly put him in a subgenre, I think. Yeah,
agreed. But I think I absolutely agree. And I think there's this interesting thing. I mean, you mentioned gothic. Obviously, his stories do feel so gothic. Yeah. And, one of the reasons, obviously, I'm discussing it at the moment is because, some of his stories, like House of Usher, for example, really do focus on the house, right? As a kind of metaphor for the mind or the psyche, right? These idea of these kind of crumbling homes or these spaces where horrors lie, and that is something that it feels like, his stories are, sometimes they are more interested, it feels like the writing feels like it's more interested in kind of describing these interesting places or these psychological states more than a kind of A to B to C narrative, right, in that regard.
Totally agree with you. I think lots of his stories are studies on a particular thing. So we are obviously going to talk briefly about The Pit and the Pendulum. Well, that feels like a study on fear, on the conditions, the conditions that somebody's put into or that are imposed upon a person, which through which fear is manifest, and what does that look like if you were to sort of get that down on the page, what does it look like if somebody's put into this position where they only have their own fear to keep them company? Again, Fall of the House of Usher, it's almost about a house that's haunted by itself.
Yes.
And I think it's really interesting because I think that I read somewhere that Poe had written down in an essay that he wasn't that fond of allegory. He didn't like allegory to the point that it became didactic. But I don't know. I don't know whether he was being playful with that or whether he was doing that thing that that writers, are perfectly at liberty to do, which is to contradict themselves and not give an honest account of what they actually think. But his work to me seems absolutely riddled with allegory, and it feels like you can enjoy it as these studies of terror, these studies of the grotesque, these studies of death and grief and guilt and things like that, or you can sit down and analyze them to within an inch of their lives. There's so much in a Poe story, I think. And even a really short one like The Telltale Heart. Mary and I on that episode, I re-listened to it to chat to you today. It's weird, isn't it? But listening to yourself, I always find it very odd. We have to do it so much when we're editing the podcasts and stuff, don't we? But to go back,
it's awful, isn't it? Yeah.
But to go back and listen to it, to the content of it.
Yes.
Odd. Anyway, but I listened to it, and I feel like in that conversation, one thing that we were able to get across is how layered those stories are, how much there is for you to map your own ideas onto, and actually how sophisticated Poe's ideas were in areas such as psychology, which the things that he's talking about or seems to be talking about are sort of decades down the line in some cases in terms of our understanding of them. So yeah. But I do think he works in this way where he sets out a tableau of a sort and explores it.
Yeah,
and I agree with you. There are only a few stories, such as The Telltale Heart, The Black Cat's another one. I think there are only a few that I know of that are really that really lean into the idea of it. This is about a story. It's about the story.
Yeah. And actually, that's an interesting thing because, in comparison, as somebody who writes, short ghost stories and that kind of thing, what do you think of them structurally? I mean, we've talked together in the past a lot about people like M.R. James and the way in which those stories kind of follow that structure of kind of working towards a big scare potentially at the end, for example. Do Poe's stories do that in a similar way, would you say?
Again, some of them do. Like, if you think about The Black Cat, that's got an incredible structure, and it's so good, that story, that it almost feels like a fable or something. It almost feels like we're so familiar with the direction that story takes that it's like the source of a cliche almost. He was this pioneering writer, but I think we can see what happens in the Black Cat coming kind of a mile off, really. But yeah, he wrote so many stories that it's hard to generalize, but he did write stories that were plotted beautifully, and others that were way stranger and way more just about a particular feeling, or that's been very reductive, but focused on a particular feeling. But we've said this about M.R. James before, haven't we, that actually plot wasn't necessarily the thing driving lots of James' stories. We can talk about A One the Curious. We can talk about the Tractate Middith as having particularly, and Casting the Runes as well as having particularly good stories. But as for the others, there's a formula. But yeah, I'm reading loads and loads of short fiction at the moment. I'm going to be writing some short page fiction, I'm realizing that the short story is distinct, as an art form. You can use it as a study. You can use it to be bizarre and odd, and there are actually no rules, I guess, with short stories in that sense. We don't have to follow a set of expectations, and I think, again, this is possibly why Poe is regarded as popularizing the short story form.
Completely agree. Let me ask you a bit about, you've mentioned The Pit and the Pendulum then. I'd love to just ask you a bit about that, and also House of Usher, because these are the films adaptations we're going to be talking about. Now, the films are pretty wildly different, right? I mean, I think it's an understatement to say they're loosely based on these stories, because The Pit and the Pendulum, I mean, that story's like 2 pages long, right? I mean, it's nothing. Yeah. It's essentially, and Roger Corman made a film out of that where he turned that story into the last 10 minutes of a film and then kind of made up a story around it, essentially, right? But just starting with The Pit and the Pendulum, maybe one of his most well-known, or I'm sure it's one where people will know that title, right? Yeah. What are your thoughts on The Pit and the Pendulum?
In all honesty, it's not one of my favourite Poe stories. Yeah. I did want to say, though, I think what's interesting about the whole Roger Corman run of films isn't that just a testament to how powerful Poe's name is in American culture? That you can make a film with the title, with the sort of vague themes perhaps of the story, and rely upon the fact that it will be successful. People might be annoyed when they go see it and it's nothing to do with it, or little to do with it. But, you were talking to James Swanson about The Raven on the main series recently. And again, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's like, what?
Nothing to do with Poe.
Exactly.
I know. No, you're so right about that. The titles kind of evoke something, don't they, in people? And obviously it's very famous, and they're famous titles, but also they're good titles.
Oh, yeah. Well, The Pit and the Pendulums, I think possibly the reason why it's not one of my favourites is because I remember hearing my English teacher described it to me, and he described it. I think my memory of it is, well, either my memory's wrong or he explained it wrong, which is that it was a choice between dying by the pit and the pendulum. I suppose to a certain extent you could see it in that way, but it's about a man who's been imprisoned by the Spanish Inquisition, and he realizes that the room he's in, after fainting a good few times and exploring the room with his hands, there's a big hole in the middle of the floor which leads down to essentially a watery grave, and that is the titular pit. And then he faints again, and he wakes up, and he's attached to this sort of, I don't know, wooden gurney thing, and above him is the emblem of, or a sort of statue of Father Time, with this swinging blade coming down ever closer.
Yeah.
But he's tied to this gurney, and he has to sort of figure out a way to escape. And that is the sum of the story. I think it's a study on fear. I think one thing, revisiting it this time, it does beautifully, is it evokes the fear that we might have of darkness itself, and also it kind of beautifully draws, I guess, a portrait of somebody in darkness, having to do something in darkness, having to figure out where they are in darkness. And I think that's one of its great strengths, actually. If you read that stuff and think, actually, it's really scary because of the darkness that's being described at the beginning.
Yes, 100%. That build up of where am I, what is this place, and the fear of this impending kind of doom. Like, I think, one of the things I'm going to talk about with Axelle is, these films, the film adaptations almost get kind of lumped in with sort of Hammer horror, and that they have that kind of look and that vibe, right? And they are in a lot of ways technically similar, but there's something particularly about these movies, and I think it's because of that Poe element, those stories of, they focus more on the kind of the idea of a prolonged death,
absolutely,
right? Or knowing your death is coming, this idea of being buried alive, or being tortured, or whatever. Yeah, exactly, like being faced with your own mortality as opposed to a shock, being bitten by a vampire or whatever it might be. Totally. Like it is. There's something about it in its ideas that is quite, and like you said, it's a study in fear, essentially, isn't it? Fear and mortality and that kind of thing.
But you're totally right. Like, death is ever present, and I think death is ever present in the majority of what we would consider to be Poe's gothic stories, and I mean, is that sort of a reflection of his life? Yeah, possibly. It's something that surrounded him quite a lot. It's a story about the sensations, isn't it? It's a story about a person's feelings and a person's sensations, and in that sense, I think it's quite right to say that it is tinged with romanticism in that sense. But but nothing really happens. And so the idea of adapting it into a film, I think the only thing you could do it's the backstory and then it's the final scene. So what other options did Corman have, really?
Yes, and obviously House of Usher as well. The Fall of the House of Usher as a story, there was a bit more there going on. But, also Corman did take some liberties in his adaptation. What do you think of the story, The Fall of the House of Usher?
I like it. I think it's a really great story. It is really motif heavy, isn't it? And it's really, again, this idea of it being allegorical, that it has to be more, well, I consider it as more or less pure allegory, and there are some beautiful metaphors in there, and it's very, very strange. It's about a man who visits his friend Roderick, who has fallen into this terrible illness in this crumbling house, which kind of has a split down the middle as he approaches. And then we discover that Roderick's sister Madeline is suffering from an illness as well, where she falls into these. I think it's described as a trance at certain points, but it's like catalepsy, isn't it? And she sort of moves into a state where it's almost like she's dead. And then of course they think she dies, and so they bury her, but of course she wasn't dead. And so there's this sort of, again, we're playing with the ghost genre here, and interwoven in there we've got Roderick singing songs on his guitar, and we've got our narrator telling medieval tales about dragons.
He loves busting out his classical guitar, this guy, whenever he gets a chance.
He does. It's the only way to get rid of melancholy. Yeah, it's to sing a song. So it's. And there's some. I mean, some of the writing in this, when he's talking about the storm later on, there's a storm. It's like absolute archetypal Gothicism. If you want to know what Gothic, or if you were going to describe Gothic to someone, you would probably pick a section from this story and just read it to them and say, that's what archetypal Gothic is. It's a a big old potentially haunted house that's crumbling with with a woman buried in the catacombs who then rises and has blood all over her dress, and there's a storm raging outside. It's very skillfully wrought, I think, beautifully written, and kind of weirdly cozy. This story, there's a coziness to it. Maybe it's the storm, I don't know.
What's interesting is in the film there is a kind of, and maybe this is partly because it's Vincent Price, but there's a sort of twinkle there. There's an element of humour. There's not a lot of humour in Poe's writing in these stories, right?
I don't think so. No, I don't get. I don't think so. I always come back to The Telltale Heart. That is my favourite Poe story, I think, and there's irony in that for sure, and it does the sort of denials of madness from this character who then demonstrates that that they are indeed, in inverted commas, mad. That there is a humour to that. I think there's an irony which verges on dark humour, I suppose. But no, I didn't get any humour in in The Fall of the House of Usher. It seems. I mean, I don't think this is where the expression Poe face comes from, but it
oh my god, yeah, I never thought about that.
I don't think it does. I'm sure it doesn't. We'll have to check.
I would love it if it did. Yeah. But yeah, that's great. Well, finally then, what other you've mentioned The Telltale Heart already. Is that your fave?
It's one of my favourites, yeah. I love The Black Cat. I mentioned that earlier. I Ligeia is a really interesting one. I mentioned earlier the facts in the case of, I think it's Monsieur Voldemar, but it's the facts in the case of M. Voldemar is how it's written. I like The Murders in the Rue Morgue. It's if you haven't read that and you don't know what the ending is, it's this detective story. It's one of the first examples, or the first example we think of a locked door mystery. If you don't know how that story ends, I guarantee you will not guess. I guarantee it. Have a read. It's really, really interesting. Yeah, so there's a bunch that I really like. I like The Raven. I think The Raven's got The Raven is possibly, it's one of the most famous poems written in the English language. I think it's probably fair to say. I think it's great, and it's very nice to revisit it from time to time. There's a whole bunch. I've got a beautiful collection. I've got a beautiful old collection. I'm showing it to you on camera, though people can't obviously see that.
Lovely.
And it's just an absolute tome of stuff. And because they are so short, you can sort of do 2 or 3 in a sitting. I think it's worth diving into Poe. I think if you've got any interest in Gothic, I think you have to visit Poe at some point.
Sure. And that was kind of going to be a nice place to sort of finish with, really. I was going to ask you, how important is he, I suppose, to the horror genre generally? Obviously there are these kind of overt film adaptations, particularly from the kind of earlier half of the 20th century, but do you still see that kind of impact, that legacy of Poe and Poe's writing in horror fiction and horror films today?
I think so, because I think that Poe went on to inspire, certainly in American literature in this sense, went on to inspire Lovecraft, and I guess in turn people like Stephen King, I would say. In terms of his legacy in other areas, of course, as I say, the detective fiction thing. If you look at Arthur Conan Doyle, look at Agatha Christie and these classic detective stories, whether they would have existed in that way without Poe's writing, very, very hard to say. I never know in situations like this, because you wonder whether someone else would have filled that gap at some point. Somebody else would have come along and had that impact. But it seems that a lot of Poe's work was very shocking at the time. It's shocking now, actually. A lot of it is really quite shocking still. Yes. But it was shocking, we might assume, because it was unusual, and it was doing stuff that other people weren't doing. But yeah, so I think his legacy is very much still active and felt in literature and cinema. I would say, yeah, for sure.
Amazing. And I've just got to finish by asking you, as a kind of short horror story and ghost story aficionado, Adam, off the back of Poe, are there any other writers that you would recommend, any other stories that you would recommend if people are fans of these sorts of stories?
I think... well, I mean, at the moment, I am absolutely devouring loads of kind of gothic short stories, and I've got a few favourites to recommend. Mariana Enriquez is a writer I've come across recently, who wrote two collections, I believe two collections. One is Things We Lost in the Fire, and the other is The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, and recently had a novel out last year called Our Share of Night. Mariana Enriquez... body horror in her work is astonishing, and whether she's directly inspired by Poe, I don't know, but there's a story in The Dangers of Smoking in Bed called Meat, and I have never been more shocked by something I've read on the page. It's honestly it's, and that's not to say that it's the most violent thing or the most horror-laden thing I've ever read, but there was something about that story that made me really, really feel disgust, not towards the writer, because she's amazing and I love her work, but a proper sense of disgust. So Mariana Enriquez is one I would recommend. Moving in the slightly more gothic and even leaning closer to M.R. James, but still with lots of interesting body stuff. Leon Craig. Leon wrote a collection called... Parallel Hells, and I was lucky enough to have Leon on my podcast, and she was amazing and talked about a couple of an M.R. James story actually, but Parallel Hells is just a brilliant debut collection of gothic stories. Kirsty Logan wrote a collection called Things We Say in the Dark, so I probably recommend Kirsty Logan's stuff, and again there's some real good grisly stuff in there. What I'm realizing is I like short stories when they're in the horror gothic genre. I like them to be weird. I like them to be really punchy in terms of their images and their ideas. I like to leave a gothic short story, with having been disturbed by a certain image. And I think this is a really Poe experience. There's a couple of Poe stories that I've read maybe once or twice, and I cannot shake the experience of being confronted with that image, to be honest. And I think that's what I'm looking for in short stories. So those three writers and those collections that I mentioned, you might not see direct parallels, but what I think you will see is that experience of being sort of shaken up a little bit by a good dose of gothic.
Love that. Adam, thank you so much. What a pleasure it's been to have you drop by to chat Poe. And you'll be back properly later on in the series. Yes. We're going to talk about something quite different, some nasty home invasion horror later on down the line.
I can't wait for that.
Your other forte. I love it.
I can't wait for that. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
It's going to be so good. In the meantime, let people know where they can find you and more of your work. Obviously, your podcast is so perfect for everything we've just been talking about. Thanks, if people want to hear more discussions of writers like Poe and other ghost stories, right? Where can people find you?
So, Twitter's probably the best place to kick off with, which is at Adam_ZED. My podcast is called The Ghost Story Book Club. On a bit of a hiatus at the moment. I'm just figuring out whether we're going to do a next series or not. I really, 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 really want to. It's just about, it's time, isn't it, Mike? It's a very time-consuming thing, isn't it?
Takes a while. Yes.
So I really want to, because it is the opportunity to get across from people and have a natter about ghost stories is just such a joy. So I think I will do another series, but I'm just figuring that out. But yeah, check that out. And the other exciting thing that is happening is, so you came to see my adaptation of Christmas Carol last December, which I did for more or less, I think, 3 weeks at Barons Court Theatre in London, which was such a pleasure, and it was a real joy. Well, a few months ago, somebody got in touch with me from a theatre in St. John, New Brunswick in Canada. And we've been chatting for a good few months. And he has invited me to take my production of Christmas Carol to the St. John Theatre Company in New Brunswick in Canada. So I'm going to be doing that for a week at the start of December. Yeah, so I'm so excited. So I'm sure you have listeners in Canada, and if any of those listeners are in New Brunswick or even Nova Scotia across the Bay of Fundy, it's easy enough to get to St. John. Come and see the show, 5th to the 9th. I know it's ages away, right? Stick it in your diary. 5th to the 9th of December, and I believe that the program has just been launched. On the 11th of May, I believe the program is to be launched. So if you're Evolution of Horror fans and you're in New Brunswick or you're in Nova Scotia or you fancy a bit of a jaunt to St. John to come and see my production, oh my goodness, what a pleasure and a privilege it would be to meet you. Yeah, so that's exciting. And we're hoping to tour Haunted in the UK in the autumn as well. So yeah, come and find me on Twitter, and I'm always banging on about what I'm doing. So.
That's so exciting. I want to come to Canada.
Come to Canada.
Come on. I came to Wharton-on-Thames. Canada's not that much further, surely, right?
Exactly. Well, we've sort of decided we think we're going to spend the whole month out there, we think. And I'm speaking to some places at the moment about the idea of maybe doing some ghost story, like just some off-the-cuff sort of ghost story readings in a couple of libraries and a pub that I was speaking to. I just want to... We love it out there. I've got the opportunity to work out there doing this show, and if I can do some other bits and pieces while I'm out there, then I'm very keen to do so.
Amazing. Yeah. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. Cheers.
A big thank you to the brilliant Adam Robinson. So let's now begin our discussions of these two films. We are going to be talking from this point onwards in spoilerific detail about House of Usher from 1960 and The Pit and the Pendulum from 1961. So, joining me to discuss all things Roger Corman, Vincent Price, and Edgar Allan Poe, a returning guest to the podcast. She was here last season discussing The Hunger with me, as well as Bela Lugosi's Dracula. And she's back speaking to me from LA. It's filmmaker Axelle Carolyn. Hello, Axelle.
Hi, it's good to be back.
It's so lovely to have you back. Thank you for being here. How is LA? You were saying it's pretty uncharacteristically gloomy right now.
Yeah, it's definitely a gloomy season in LA for sure. But it's very Usher. It's very Pit and the Pendulum. It's very Roger Corman. I love it. It's great.
Yes, it's perfect Edgar Allan Poe weather, right?
Yes.
Amazing. So this season we are talking all about kind of domestic set horror. Later on down the line we're going to be talking about traditional home invasion, but for now we're leaning more into the kind of old dark house sort of proto home invasion stuff, I suppose. And I'd love to ask you, as a filmmaker, Axelle, what do you think is the reason for the home as being such an important setting in horror cinema?
I mean, it depends what kind of home you're looking at. I think that there's been this big evolution between, and I guess that the movies we're looking at are kind of at the time where things have changed in that regard, but there's kind of a before and after where you had the movies that took place in the old castle and the very gothic settings and the, kind of the crumbling mansion, which is kind of what we're going to look at today. And then around the beginning of the 60s, they started having horrors that strike at home and strike very close to your everyday life. And I guess that's a different kind of fear. It's not the bizarre and the kind of difficult to imagine faraway scares of the traditional Gothic horror. It's more, no, this could happen right here. This could, I could be sitting in my sofa right now and there could be something behind me at this moment. Very immediate, very relatable, very, I'm obsessed with houses and horror in general. I love the architecture of horror. I love kind of the setting in general is such a big part of the atmosphere of any kind of movie, but specifically in horror. And I love looking at the architecture and looking at the evolution of that. That's very much my thing.
Yeah, and we've talked before in this podcast about how you're a big fan of the kind of gothic horror particularly, but I was thinking about your work even as a filmmaker and director, right? Your feature film, Soulmate, and especially your episodes of things like The Haunting of Bly Manor, the Mike Flanagan show, where it feels like you do give a lot of attention to the importance of the setting, the geographical space, the house, the old dark house, that kind of thing. Has that always been very important to you in the work that you direct?
Oh, totally. And even if it's not necessarily a house, Soulmate was set in a cottage, but I felt like, to me, the atmosphere came from Wales, came from the landscape around it, which is also a very gothic, kind of early romantic preoccupation, I guess. Although the Anne Radcliffe books were very much like linked to nature and the creepiness of the grand landscapes. But yeah, it's one of the things I like the most. I very much, some people come up with stories just thinking of a specific event or thinking of a specific monster, and I tend to think in terms of settings and atmosphere.
Yeah,
that's what excites me in general.
Yeah, totally.
Again, thinking of architecture, I thought how fun it is to see that we went from those big Victorian mansions and the crumbling castle and the kind of faraway land to suddenly every house in horror seemed to be craftsman houses. I don't know if that's less a British thing, obviously, but in America, you went from the Victorian, which is this big, extravagant house with the turrets and all the decoration and very decadent and the kind of thing that rich people would buy to show their richness, and they would have like the most intricate furniture and decor. And then there's something about that, the moment that it starts crumbling and, when it went out of fashion, rich people moved out of it and became those crumbling kind of mansions that were so interesting to film in, and that became kind of the more grandiose, kind of more again operatic, I guess, movies like Hocus Pocus or Beetlejuice or like The Addams Family or Psycho or something that's a little bit more out of the ordinary. And then the Craftsman House, which is kind of the house from the beginning of the 20th century, which is more dark and lower ceilings and kind of lots of wood paneling. That's like Insidious is one of those ones.
Right.
And suddenly after Insidious, everyone's shooting in a Craftsman House. And it's really like, you can't, I'm trying to find one because I want to buy a house. And several places I visited were like, oh, we filmed The Pact 2 in this house. Oh, they filmed this horror movie in this house.
Exactly. And do you think that's interesting? I hadn't really thought about it in terms of the architecture, and I'm not an expert on what makes a kind of a craftsman house. But is that the same kind of house that we got in, for example, John Carpenter's Halloween, where there was then that big wave of movies set in those kind of white picket kind of suburban houses, I suppose? Yeah,
they're a little bit different architecturally, but yes, they're that kind of idea of the suburban, and they're also all, I mean, a lot of that is in Pasadena, because Pasadena in LA is kind of what passes most for the rich suburban all-American neighborhood, I guess.
And it's kind of interesting to see the ways in which different homes spark different kind of horror too, because you've got your kind of your big gothic house in the middle of nowhere, you've got a suburban house in the middle of a street, you've then got apartment movies too, right? You've got like, Rosemary's Baby or Rear Window or Rope or whatever, these movies set in busy apartment blocks, and again, kind of different ways in which where is the danger, where is the fear coming from in those different types of builds is kind of has been interesting to look at as well.
Yes, and I one of my theories for why older houses are so interesting when it comes to horror movies are not just, I mean, when you think of hauntings, the remnants of the people who used to live here, there's something so weird about the fact that you're in a building that is so intrinsically linked to who you are and to your personality. But the person who lived in my condo before me, I saw photos of how she decorated. It was a completely different place. Yeah. And the person before that, I'm sure, must have done something completely different too. So it's just so weird that like someone else lived here, someone else like shed hair here. And when you look at, like air ducts and things in houses, when you clean them, it's literally bits of someone else. It's like bits of skin and bits of hair. And like it's like people leave a little bit of their like body in the house that you would have
self.
It's really creepy.
Yeah, that's so
even
true.
worse if you talk about hotels. I mean, that's just gross. But like the idea of people successively like doing the most intimate things of their life, like sleeping, like having sex, whatever, in the same bed that you're now renting.
Yes,
it's just so bizarre.
You're so right about that. I think it's one of those things that we all live with day to day, and we just don't think about or don't want to think about in that way. Yeah, and does the history of a certain house bother you? For example, like, would you have been reluctant to move into your place if you had heard that somebody had died there, for example, or that something tragic or violent had happened there?
No, I think I'd be obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Again, I'm trying to find a house, and I really want an old house, and I love that there's history, and I love that the weirdness of someone else having lived there. And some of the houses I look at, they've kept photos from the various times of when people have lived. Obviously, they're not going to tell you this guy died in the bath or something, but like much more about the previous people who've lived in the house, and you can see photos of how they decorated, and you can see photos of the house being built, and I find all that fascinating.
Yeah.
But then again, I'm attracted to anything that's a little bit creepy and a little bit horror themed. So perhaps that's why I'm more sensitive to that. But I do love a sense of history. And if someone had died in the house, it kind of feels like, especially maybe less so in LA because it's a more recent city, but in London we say that you can't set foot on anything without stepping on a dead body.
Exactly.
Like, people have died everywhere. They've been there for long enough, and the density of population is such. So, you know, when I was in London, I used to live in an old converted church, and I don't know what they did with the churchyard, but there's houses all over around the church. So clearly,
oh my God,
I hope they didn't just move the tombs, but they also moved the body.
This is exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, you've got a real poltergeist scenario on your hands there with that one. So feels like a nice segue into talking about the big gothic world of Edgar Allan Poe. And before we get into the films, let me just quickly ask you, Axelle, are you a fan generally of Edgar Allan Poe and his writing?
I am, yes. Although I'm kind of a lapsed fan because I haven't read his work in a very long time. But growing up, I was very attracted to the dark side of things. I was very much into ghosts and skeletons, and I wasn't allowed to watch anything particularly dark. I wasn't allowed to watch much, to be honest. Mm-hmm. But my dad had a collection of books, and the first ones that I picked up were Poe. And I must have been about 8. And when I reread now, when I have a look at how he writes, I'm amazed that 8-year-old Axelle was that much into Poe.
Yes.
But that was my introduction into the world of horror and the gothic, and and so I guess that very much shaped my understanding of the genre for sure. So and I love that. I was obviously 8 is a little young, but later on I became this kind of moody teenager who's a little bit depressed, a little bit gothic, a little bit and so all those long descriptions of someone's moodiness and depression,
yes,
and attention to feelings, and like he'll spend entire paragraphs talking about the gloom and doom that he feels looking at this house. Is just it's so great, so great.
That is so true, isn't it? I was going to ask you about that, like what makes him such a kind of popular horror writer, and it feels to me like it is that, right? It's those long emotional descriptions of the way things feel in his stories, as opposed to, I guess, the narrative, right? In a way, it's more about the mood.
His command of the language is phenomenal, but also, yes, I think it's that dark romanticism. It's that kind of attention to the slightest feeling and wallowing a little bit in the feelings of depression and of. But I think that's very much part of the Gothic. It's suppressed desires, it's longing, it's exploring the darkness of your personality and your moods, and he does that better than anybody, I think. And that mix of the environment creating monsters, and it's fascinating. And also, Paul's life has led to, he is a character from his stories. He is a fascinating character. The fact that we don't really know how he died, like really he went on the bender and he was found kind of mumbling incoherently and was brought to a hospital. We don't really know what happened. There's so much about his weird obsession for his cousins, and
didn't he married his first cousin right when she was 13?
There's a lot of and a lot of longing for women who should have been out of bounds. And there was a bizarre trend in the 19th century. People found tuberculosis to be very appealing. Like if you were dying of consumption and you were pale and frail as a woman, that was something that was very desirable. And he completely played into that cliche. Like, oh, you're sick. Oh, that's hot.
That's so weird,
so
isn't it?
All of it is weird. And I love that he's become kind of a character that we see in fiction, in Pale Blue Eye and The Raven.
Yes.
All those movies where they portray Poe as a full-fledged hero.
Right, and there is also that obsession in Poe's work we've discussed already about kind of disease, the thin veil between life and death in that regard, right?
Yeah, but even the aesthetic, the look of the women who were, even in the movies, who were picked with the raven hair and the very pale skin, and none of them's about to break into a run. They're all kind of like languid, and it's a very specific type of aesthetic that he was into.
Let's talk about Roger Corman, because again, like he did 7 or 8 Poe adaptations right through the 60s. What was it about this marriage of Poe and Roger Corman and Vincent Price too, right, that kind of worked so well?
I think he was obsessed with Poe before he started. Like I think Corman is the one who brought the idea of Poe to his producers, to the IP.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know why it took off so well at that specific point, because it is a little bit after Hammer started doing those kinds of movies, I suppose, but it just captures something so specifically. And like you said, like Vincent Price was such a great character to play those very dramatic, very larger than life, very theatrical characters that Poe described. He was so good at all that kind of intricate dialogue that was the combination of Richard Madison's writing and Poe's sourced material. And he delivers those lines like it's very natural to him, like he's been doing that his whole life, which he actually has. So yeah, he brings a lot of gravitas, but he also brings a lot of fun. He always has that kind of twinkle in his eye that makes it very clear that he's enjoying what he's doing.
So fun.
And makes it very delightful. And he's just someone who enjoys being the villain in so many of those stories. And you can see that. And I think that's a very big part of why he was so likable and endearing and such a great presence and so charismatic, is that twinkle, is that delight that he brings to everything that he's doing. Yeah, I adore him. I really do.
I do as well. We'll talk about him as we go throughout these films, but he, like you said, there's that perfect blend of kind of wickedness with a twinkle in his eye too, right? There's just something so sort of lovable about him in any role he plays, even when he's at his most evil. I always feel like Witchfinder General is his most kind of out and out evil role that he plays, right? But even that, there's something of a weird sort of likability, or again a twinkle in his eye in everything he does. He's just so brilliant. Yeah,
I'm very lucky, by the way, Mike, that you always invite me to talk about. I got to talk about Bela Lugosi twice now, with White Zombie and Dracula, and now I get to come back and talk about Price. So it's
no.
These are all my favorites.
Well, I love it. I love being able to chat to you about these people. But let's just quickly move back to Roger Corman, because what a legend. And he's not somebody we've really spoken about much on this podcast either. And, you know, he came to this with a very certain kind of brief, I suppose, right? You know, he had a specific budget, he had a specific time frame, and what he pulled off feels like kind of then is what set the template for not just the rest of his kind of Poe adaptations and the movies that he would direct, but also as a producer, right? That he would kind of go on to teach so many directors how to be a filmmaker like him, it felt like.
I had been making a series of low-budget films for two companies, Allied Artists and American International. Each one would be black and white, shot on a 10-day schedule with a budget of $70,000 or $80,000. They would send out the pictures as a double bill, 2 pictures for the price of 1. It was time to move on. And I said, what I'd like to do is take double the budget and shoot a film in color and have 15 days instead of 10. Jim Nicholson, who was the head of AIP, agreed immediately. Sam Markoff, who was his partner but more involved with business, but still a little bit in the creative, said, but Roger, there's a problem. There's no monster in The Fall of the House of Usher. Thinking fairly quickly, I said, Sam, the house is the monster. And on that basis, they said, yes, I could make The Fall of the House of Usher.
He's very creatively, he's a very good director, but he also brings that incredibly good, low budget producer sensibility where he knows exactly what he needs. And one of the things that I've found very interesting that everybody who works in production should be inspired by is those movies were shot in 15 days.
Yes.
It's pretty quick, which is a luxury next to what he had in the 70s when he was making movies in 3 days or 4 days. But what he explained was that he had a month for pre-production. He had twice as long to prep his movies as he had to actually film them. And so he prepped them within an inch of his life. And he knew exactly what he's going to be shooting. And I think that's always, that's the saving grace, working TV a lot these days. And that's, if you haven't prepped it properly, you're going to be dead in the water. So I'm glad to see that even back then in the 60s, when you only had like one set to film on, that was the secret to it all, was being prepared, knowing what you're going to be shooting. And then I love that he didn't want to, he said that in those movies, he wanted to make a point of not showing reality. He didn't want to go and shoot in the outside world. But in both movies we're looking at today, he goes and picks little, like in Usher, the first few shots are a fire in the Hollywood Hills has left all those trees burned down. And he heard about the fire and he said he grabbed the camera and he went and got like 4 shots. And he repeats those shots and they look beautiful and it really set the tone. And then Kid in the Pendulum, he went to shoot in Palos Verdes, which is like south of Los Angeles, and just got some shots of the coast just to give a little bit of atmosphere, but something that doesn't really situate it too much. He's very smart and very economical in the way that he shoots.
Right, and I think he's now become more famous in a way for being a producer, right? Like, it's Roger Corman who kind of introduced the world to so many great filmmakers. He gave people like Martin Scorsese, Joe Dante, Francis Ford Coppola.
James Cameron.
Yeah, James Cameron, exactly. He gave all of these world-class filmmakers their first gigs and kind of showed them the ropes, right? And, you know, his thing was that he was creating kind of low-budget, high-profit films, not necessarily always films that were considered quote unquote great art, but kind of like high energy filmmaking. You had to be creative, you had to be smart in the way that you planned, right, as well. And I think, like you said, it's about the preparation time. There's a really fun interview online with Martin Scorsese where he's talking about what he learned from working for Corman was that idea of prepare everything within an inch of its life, because you're always on the back foot time-wise when making films.
Because the one thing I learned from Roger was total preparation. The idea was to get the energy of the person who was driven to make movies. And he just took advantage of that fresh blood, so to speak, and that fresh energy, the enjoyment, the craziness of making a picture in 15 days. On Unholy Rollers, when I brought in the rough cut to him, and I walked in, he said, how long is the picture? I said, an hour and 7 minutes, because we got a problem. And he spoke to Vernon and whatever, and they went back and shot a scene or two and went and put it back in. He just knew the length had to be a certain way. But I've never seen anybody just be so extraordinary in terms of pacing of a picture and knowing the audience that it's for. You know?
It just feels like Roger Corman really knew how to use a budget effectively to create something that maybe looks bigger than it is, I suppose, right?
And then it really allowed him to... Those movies don't look like they're that cheap. I don't think anyway. When I look at those Corman movies, I think they look lush and they look beautiful, but he would have his production designers and art people go and find every little piece that they could salvage from former sets and put it all together. And then he would preserve the set that he had for Usher, and he would use it for Pendulum the Pendulum, and he would build on it. And then for the next movie, he would build on that. And so the set looked increasingly elaborate and increasingly lush and beautiful. But it's about preserving things. And then I know that towards a little bit later in his career, he would say, well, we just shot this with Boris Karloff. We still have 2 days that he owes us from this contract. We're going to shoot an entire different picture where we're going to use it for those 2 days, and it's going to be on the same set as the movie we just did so that we can reuse those movies, and we're going to shoot this one in 3 days. And it just...
I love it.
It's so smart.
Yeah.
But it's also very... I mean, I can see how, as a filmmaker, it would be frustrating as well, but there's something fantastic about... He left a genuine legacy, and he didn't make them to look cheap. He used dolly moves. He used great, like, CinemaScope. He used... those beautiful colors. He used wide-angle lenses. He used distorted lenses. He really went for it. He really gave it a whole, like, high angles and low angles, and like and the camera's constantly moving. It's not done on the cheap. And there's matte paintings in there. The matte painting of the house is fantastic.
I love that. Yeah, and actually, this is maybe a controversial thing to say, but I think for that reason, because people often compare these movies to Hammer, and I've heard a lot of people say, you know, like, oh, it's a little bit kind of, you know, a couple of people I've spoken to have sort of said, oh, it's almost a bit sub-Hammer. I think these films are better, personally, than Hammer horror movies on the whole. Like, I'm not the biggest... I have a few Hammer films that I love, but on the whole, I don't love them as much as I love these films. And I think because these movies feel a bit more weird and subversive, and they kind of go into sort of weirder places, like these weird dream sequences and these kind of slightly queasier, more surreal moments. And some of it is genuinely creepy to me as well, I think, more than Hammer. But yeah, I love the way that, and I feel like that does come down to Corman and his kind of creativity as well. Like you said, he's kind of thought of as being this kind of great kind of like kind of producer, low budget producer, but clearly also so creative with his filmmaking.
I think that I gotta send you a list of weird Hammer, because they've done some weird shit in their day.
Yeah, I know, and I'm going to be crucified for what I just said. And I do, you know, I have not seen as many Hammer films as most Hammer fans out there, so maybe I'm still missing out on a load of gems. So I am talking very generally there from my own experiences, but yeah.
I'm a big fan of both, and Hammer, I kind of like the classic ones more than I like the ones where they go into completely bizarre stuff, but they did play with some strange ideas as well. But I think they're comparable. I think they're both. What I'll say is that the one downside I see with the Corman cycle is that they're all fairly similar to each other.
Yes, that is true. Yes.
I think perhaps my favorite is The Haunted Palace, which ironically is not really based on Poe. It's based on Lovecraft. It only has the Poe title. And I love that one. That's a slightly different... I don't know. I guess you could summarize most of them by saying some completely normal, boring person comes to a castle where Vincent Price, who is the symbol of insanity, receives him and proceeds to show him that the house is full of horrors.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we'll talk about these two films now individually. But I think we were saying before we started recording, right, these films are so similar to each other that it is almost like, what can you say about each of them separately, right? And you are right about that. Like, they all very much follow the same structure, don't they? I think that is true. Like, you're not going to get a whole amount of variation, I think.
But they're both worth watching, though. They're both very fun. They're just very, when you watch them back to back, if I told you in which one does he walk around at night and suddenly find the woman asleep in the hallway, would you know right away which one I'm talking about?
No. And like, you know, the kind of like sarcophaguses on the walls with the names written on them. And I'm like, is that in both of them or is that in one of them? Like, there are certain images that are just in both films and certain story beats that are in both films. So yeah, we'll do our best to kind of separate and go through each one individually. But I think it was worth us talking generally there about Corman, I think, and his adaptations. And I think, go back to what we were talking about initially as well, how different this is from the other stuff we were getting in the early 60s too, right? Like you said, it's kind of almost a little bit, I don't know if you'd call it behind the curve a little bit, but it's so different to that kind of that newer, edgier stuff that a lot of American or European filmmakers were doing from 1960 onwards, right? It feels like this is kind of unapologetically kind of old school and gothic in that regard. You know?
It is, but it's also the first time they have an American horror movie in color. It's also the first time that the Hammer films brought back the classics in 1957. So this is 1960. We're not that far behind the curve. I mean, all those it's bringing back works that were popular in the 19th century, or that kind of gothic sensibility that we saw with Universal Pictures, or that we saw earlier in the century, in the 20th century. But it's still kind of the first time that we see them in this time. Like, they disappeared for a long time, and then they were kind of comedies, and then this is the big revival. I mean, it's funny to see that evolution happened. The two things happened at the same time. They became obsolete almost the moment that they came back.
Yes, yeah, you're so right about that.
But it's very strange to see those two trends, and to me they both culminate in Rosemary's Baby, which I feel works perfectly as this kind of old-fashioned, like the spooky old house and the weird supernatural and the dream sequences and all that kind of stuff that feels very kind of Cormanish, and at the same time is completely contemporary and feels like something that can happen every day. Or talks about a pregnant woman, which is something that you wouldn't have seen in a movie 20 years before. Or
you're so right. You're so right. These weird mixes of, like, I'm also thinking of a movie that I can see in the background of your camera right now, Axelle, which is Eyes Without a Face. That incredible kind of mix of the old Gothic house with real, like, almost new French extremity body horror kind of mixed in as well, right? Like, just beautiful and incredible. And oh god, what an amazing, like, the 1960s were just such a interesting time for horror, I think.
Oh man, if I could pick one time period, I would have liked to be a filmmaker in the 60s. I would have liked to be, like, working with Bava, working with Terence Fisher, working with Corman.
Yes.
I wouldn't have been able to, because no women were doing anything at the time.
Yeah, that's so true.
And that's the dream anyway.
Yeah, no, you're so right. And actually, funnily enough, Bava, like, do you think that I've read that from a couple of critics that that maybe these sorts of movies inspired what came after in terms of Italian horror as well? Do you see that connection in terms of, like, what Italian horror did throughout the 60s and 70s? Do you think it owes a debt to Corman's work here?
Yeah, I think so. But also, I mean, wasn't Black Sunday 1960?
It was, yeah. It was same year.
So
Yeah.
pretty much, yeah. And funnily, Barbara Steele, another one I absolutely adore, by the way. She's kind of the equivalent to me of a Price or of a Christopher Lee, or and she's in kind of The Pendulum. She's in all those Italian movies I love.
Yeah.
She's
I know, incredible.
she bridges it.
She really does. She really does. So let's talk about House of Usher then, from 1960.
Madeline and I are like figures of fine glass. The slightest touch and we may shatter. Both of us suffer from a morbid acuteness of the senses. Mine is the worse for having existed the longer, but both of us are afflicted with it. Any sort of food more exotic than the most pallid mash is unendurable to my taste buds. Any sort of garment other than the softest is agony to my flesh. My eyes are tormented by all but the faintest illumination. Odors assail me constantly. And as I've said, sounds of any degree whatsoever inspire me with terror.
It's a fairly simple story, Axelle, but set us up. What's the story?
So our normie, average person kind of guy, compared to everything else, travels to this old mansion, the House of Usher, to visit his fiancée. And the brother of the fiancé, Roderick Usher, played by Vincent Price, says that the bloodline is cursed and that the mansion itself is affected and the walls themselves are diseased, and that he can't let his sister leave the house because the madness of the Usher cannot be perpetuated into another generation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the main thing in the story is that Roderick Usher suffers from a hypersensitivity to light and sound that drives him to madness. And he says that that's something that's inherited and that everybody in the family has had some kind of bizarre insanity. And that's kind of where a lot of things come from in the story. And this explains it, but then doesn't do that much with it. But yeah, the basic idea is the house is diseased, the family is diseased. She's convinced she's about to die. She may or may not die in the middle of the movie, and there's all the typical themes of Poe that we actually see again in Pen and the Pendulum, of like premature burial, grief, and descent into madness, and all kinds of.
Yes, exactly. It's there's a lot of that, a lot of sickliness, madness, being buried alive. So what do you think generally of this movie, Axelle? Like, what's your history with it? Are you a fan?
I like it a lot. It's not my favorite of the bunch. For completely arbitrary reasons. The main one being I don't like how Price looks in this movie.
Interesting.
And it was apparently completely his choice. He decided that he would look more sickly with bleach blonde hair and weird eyebrows and no beard. And I agree, he looks bizarre and disturbing. And I prefer my classic Price. So just for that visual reason, I like it a little less. And my other gripe with it is that I suffer from misophonia, which is a sensitivity to certain types of noise, specifically noises made by people when they breathe or they like. If some motherfucker is behind me at the theater, 6 rows behind me, eating popcorn with his mouth open, the only thing I'll hear for the entire movie. And also I've had migraines where the slightest little bit of light that filters through the drapes drives me nuts. So when Vincent Price explains that he's heard the hooves of the horse as the man approaches, and he's heard every footsteps, and it's heard. And he's like composing a little ditty on his lute as he does that. I'm like, man, I can't. How? What? This is not consistent. That makes no sense. And the other thing with that is the colors, the Eastman color that they use, which is the same process, I believe, as Hammer films actually, looks gorgeous, and I love it. And I could like lick every frame of that screen. It's so beautiful. But what it doesn't do is create a moody atmosphere when you walk in the castle, you feel like you need to switch on a light. And at some point in the dialogue, the visitor says, you need to light some candles. It's too dark in here. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You can see every corner of this house. And there's an argument that had they shot it in black and white with older kind of processes, it might have given more of that impression of a decaying house. and have a moody place with shadows and where you can't see very well, and we're like conveying more of that madness of the house. But it's a gorgeous movie otherwise.
I love it. It made me laugh. It's so over the top. He's so dramatic, Vincent Price, in this. He's so extra. It reminds me, this is what I'm like on a hangover, Axelle. I'm like, I can't eat anything beyond the most pallid mash. I don't like light. I don't like anyone touching me. I don't like any loud noises. He's a really funny character. But you're right. His look is quite unnerving and creepy, isn't it? That blonde hair and the shaved face. It doesn't look like your classic Vincent Price kind of persona.
He looks disturbing, and I love that he went for that. And it is very striking, very interesting. And in a slightly different film, I think it would have worked to his advantage. But in this, with the color, with the lighting, with the fact that his hair looks bright yellow, there's something about it that I just can't. It's very personal taste, and I'm very open to anybody saying that this is insane and it's actually his finest performance, but it just, to me, just kind of gets in the way of enjoying it.
I love how much he keeps busting out his lute to play to people as well, playing his weird little songs to people.
I mean, for a guy who doesn't like noise, he cannot shut up.
Remarkable. And you composed it yourself.
It's really funny. That's the thing. There are moments in this film that really made me laugh, and there is a sense of comedy about it. And I don't know if that's just in Price's performance or the way Corman directs it, but there is something larger than life, I guess, about it.
There's
in a weird way.
There's a sense of the grand guignol in it.
Yeah.
There's something about making something so outrageous and being aware of what you're doing. And it's a little bit. It's a strange comparison, I guess, but it's kind of what I'm looking for in slashers nowadays. I don't want them to be completely postmodern. I don't want them to be funny, but I like, when you play with tropes, I like to feel that the filmmaker is aware that they're playing with a trope. And I feel that through Price, we're very aware of, hey, we know what we're doing here. We know what this is. And that makes it so much more enjoyable. And without taking away from the fact that the effects are made to shock and that there are moments where, as Corman describes, the audience is going to scream, and he's not taking away from the scares, but he does have fun with it.
Every footstep, every rustle of your clothes, I could hear your horse approaching, hear the clatter of its hooves across the courtyard, your knock. The grating of the doorbolt was like a sword stroke to my ears. I can hear the scratch of rat claws within the stone wall. Mr. Winthrop, 3/4 of my family have fallen into madness, and in their madness have acquired a superhuman strength, so that it took the power of many to subdue them.
Do you not exaggerate, sir?
How we've spoken about him already a bit, but what is it about Vincent Price, particularly, I guess, compared to some of his contemporaries like, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and stuff like that? What is it about Price that kind of makes him kind of, I guess, different from some of those other sort of horror legends of the time?
Well, they're all kind of comparable in that they all come from theater one way or another, I suppose. Peter Cushing's the one who strikes me as being the most different from that bunch, because he really went for realism in everything he was doing. And he was doing, whether he was in the most ludicrous movie or if he was in something that was more grounded, he was always very truthful and very grounded and very interesting. And he would bring props and he would, he would try to give it some reality. Well, I feel like if Price had been left alone on that stage, at the end of the day, when the crew is gone, he would still walk around and make gestures.
Yes. Yes.
And recite lines and enjoy the fact that he's there and wear the outrageous costume and just...
Yes.
It's that, again, it's that sense of relishing what he's doing that I feel sets him apart. I never feel like Christopher Lee is 100% enjoying what he's doing.
No. No, which can make him makes him scarier. And I think because there's something quite scary about Christopher Lee anyway, like I would have been quite scared to ever meet him and interview him, I think. Whereas I think I would have been over the moon at the idea of meeting Vincent Price. Do you know what I mean? Like, not because I think Vincent Price is necessarily better than Christopher Lee. I just think that he's probably got that slightly more, like, he is enjoying what he does a little bit more.
I met Christopher Lee a few times, and he was very intimidating and not always super nice.
Yes.
And still, like, I have a picture that I posted on Instagram a bunch of times because it's one of my favorite pictures. But you can look, I'm 20 and I'm looking at him like it's the most amazing person I've ever seen in my life. And he'd just been a total dick to me, and it didn't change a thing. Because I'm like, it's Christopher Lee. This is who he is in the movies. I'm fine with that. But yes, I'm sure Price would have been lovely when you hear the stories of how he took Tim Burton under his wing and did the short film Vincent with them, and then went on to do Edward Scissorhands. I mean, can you imagine your idol being so open to your work and supportive, and I think that that's a big difference between the two, is that one of them really enjoyed his status as a horror icon and the other resented it and felt like he should have been doing more varied work.
Yes. And I love that kind of Vincent Price-ness about him. Like, you know, that he is a kind of persona in of himself too. Like, you know, even like, I think this was earlier, wasn't it? House on Haunted Hill. The trailer for House on Haunted Hill, where he's just like, hello, I'm Vincent Price. And there's something of a kind of like a personality about him, even just as the guy, right? As well, that I sort of love.
Yes, there will be drinks and food and ghosts.
Yeah, it's so good. I love it. I love him.
Yeah. He was very established already by the time that he did the Corman movies.
Yeah.
And he was established as a I mean, he'd done slightly different things like gothic romance, like Dragon Wick previously, but he was mostly the Tingler, the House of Wax, and House on Haunted Hill, and, you know, the Willem Castle movies, and The Fly.
Of course. Yeah, of course. What do you think of his character of Roderick Usher then in this as well? Like, the sort of the monster, the villain, although it's interesting because Corman talks about the house being the monster, right, in this movie. But like, you know, Roderick himself, very kind of like passive guy. But is he the real monster in this story?
I think he's very sympathetic, strangely.
Yeah.
I think he's kind of, and again, when you see those, I keep calling them the bland character or the normal guy, but I suppose we're supposed to a degree to see the movie through their eyes, but it feels like in this one, there's moments where we see through the eyes of Price's character. There's definitely a few moments where you understand what he's doing because you see what he's seeing that the others are not noticing, like when the hand moves in the coffin and he goes and closes the coffin.
Love that moment.
That's a moment where we see, and the way that he panics when he sees it, and we don't really know why does he think he's imagining it? Does he just really want to get his sister to get it over with?
Yes.
Like, I'm not quite sure what the motivation is, but his face when he sees his sister move in her coffin is just fantastic.
So good. Yeah, you're right. That weird. It's almost comedic. He's like, oh, quick, shut the lid. Yes. Like, you know, it's great. Yeah, he is a really interesting character because what exactly he wants his sister to die because he's worried that she's going to kind of turn evil and bring evil to the outside world, essentially, right? That he believes
he wants the bloodline. Yes. Yeah. I think he wants the bloodline to die, and I think that he's convinced that she's suffering as much as he is, and so he just wants an end to it all. And those eyebrows, man, they don't rest much, do they?
So good. So good. What about the house itself then? You know, like I mentioned, Roger Corman talked about the house being the monster in this. There's obviously a lot of dialogue, you know, about the house itself being evil. What do you think of this house that we spend, you know, 99% of the story in?
But did you read why he said that the house was the monster?
Because the producers were like, we need a monster in this, right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I love it.
Which I love. It's a very Corman kind of response.
Yes.
So who's the monster in the movie? And instead of saying Usher, he said the house. And then he added those lines, and apparently Price would say, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And it just said, just go with it. Just go with this. Trust me.
It's great.
Yeah. And to his defense, he does shoot the house. He shoots the hell out of it. And the house is very much heavily featured in the original short story as well. And you know, it's very described. But there's all those shots of the visitor exploring. I keep calling him names because I can't remember what the name of the character is. But he's walking down the hallways and various things move, and there's a chandelier that's kind of beautifully framed in the foreground, and then we wrap around it, and the chandelier falls on him. It's a really cool effect. And there's a bunch of different like spooky things that happen around the house and make it seem like maybe there's something that's trying to get him out of there. Which don't necessarily make a ton of sense unless I've missed some kind of twist.
I know. Yeah. But I know. It's quite unclear to begin with. It's sort of ambiguous, right, as to whether or not is it literally that the house is this supernatural, do you think?
I don't think it's meant to be. I think it's played out like it is supernatural, but it's very interestingly, Corman always made a strong point of saying that these two movies are not supernatural.
Exactly.
That these are very kind of, and it's interesting because at the end of the day, it's very much what the early gothic fiction novels used to do. You know, the Anne Radcliffe novels where the explanation was always, but actually it was all a crime.
Right.
You know, a human being was behind it all. Because when gothic fiction started back in the 1700s, there was a big wave of criticism against it that said, we're in the age of reason. Why do you bring all those superstitions into your work? And I find it really fun that you have the same, when this new wave of gothic fiction comes in, Corman is kind of doing the same thing of like, no, this is based on the human brain.
Yeah, I know. That's right. He really wanted to take a kind of Freudian and kind of psychological approach to these, didn't he, as well? Yeah. Yeah, I think that is really interesting because, you know, I didn't cover these movies when I did kind of ghost story movies. And I thought, should I have really? Because in a way, they are kind of ghost stories just without the ghosts, right? But they are essentially kind of haunted house movies in the way that I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago too, about Hitchcock's Rebecca, sort of a ghost story without a literal ghost in it, right? But that idea of this house with this history and this figure's kind of looming presence within the house, you know? But I do think that's a really interesting kind of grey area, those kind of ghost stories that don't have ghosts in them. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, totally. I think perhaps the closest to that would be the Haunted Palace, because you actually have the ancestor, the old warlock who possesses the Vincent Price's character, and so that's a little bit more ghostly. It also is kind of folk horror because it's a warlock curse, so it fits into a lot of different boxes. But I love that one. Have you seen that one?
I haven't actually. No, I haven't seen that one.
Oh, it's fun. It's good.
I need to check that one out. Yeah, but yeah, I do. I love the house in this, and I think even more so in The Pit and the Pendulum. We'll talk about it more on The Pit and the Pendulum. But I love this kind of old dark house vibe of kind of like secret passageways and you know like hidden torture chambers and like houses that are kind of filled with secrets and secret rooms and corridors and all of that kind of thing. You know, I think all of that stuff's really interesting. And what about the kind of, you know, we talked about this already, but the kind of psychological approach that Corman wanted to take, you know, that he didn't want to make it look realistic. He did deliberately want it to look kind of almost this kind of, I think he talked about kind of unconscious kind of storytelling or filmmaking, right? And there are these kind of actual sort of dream sequences as well, aren't there? Like there's that whole queasy dream sequence towards the end. What did you think of that? Yeah,
I love it. Oh, I love it. I think it's so great. I love the scene where he goes, and it's such a great trope, but he goes to look at the portraits of the ushers of the past, and there's the old captain, and all those portraits looks amazing. Like,
so good.
I would kill to have one. And apparently Vincent Price is the one who found the artist that they commissioned to make it. Price was a huge art lover. There's still a Vincent Price art gallery somewhere in LA, which I visited, and is really interesting in how eclectic his tastes were. So he was very big on those paintings. And so you have that moment where you see the various different characters, and then they come back in the dream, and there's Captain who's chasing them. It's just so good. It's so great. And it's so interesting again for this kind of material that you would think is kind of old-fashioned and is very classical, and then you have those sequences where he would go and find bizarre lenses to shoot on, and he would use all those strange processes and put filters and then like work with the film stock and change the colors on that. And I don't know, it just creates something that's at once feels of a piece with the rest of the movie, but also is kind of weird and
Yeah.
a little bit disquieting.
My theory was that if Poe was working with the unconscious mind, the unconscious is not really aware of the outside world. The outside world gives us stimuli through our eyes, our ears, our nose, even taste, and transmits this stimuli to the unconscious mind, which is only aware of the information given to it and is not aware of the outside world. So I felt I wanted to create a dreamlike interior world. For that reason, I shot all of the pictures on a sound stage where I had full control of what I was doing. I very seldom went outside.
I think he's less successful, again, I'm jumping to Pit and the Pendulum, but he's kind of trying to do the same thing with the flashback sequences in that, and I find them less successful. Perhaps because they're more narrative and they're more they're story driven, while this is so abstract and bizarre.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, both of them are sort of loose adaptations, but House of Usher is a little bit more of an adaptation of the actual story, and yet it feels like there is less narrative in a way, and it's more of a kind of mood film. Whereas Pit and the Pendulum, where they had to create 90% of the narrative because it wasn't in Poe's story, that actually feels more plot driven with actual story twists and that kind of thing.
It feels like it's driven towards something. It feels like in the Pit and the Pendulum, they know where they want to land, and so that's kind of driving the whole thing. And in this one, it's a little bit more kind of atmospheric and dream world, and I mean, they know where it's going to end, and I love the ending. It's, again, such a classic kind of the fight between the sister and the brother, and the house crumbling, and the house is burning, but then suddenly it's falling into falling apart in the last shot that you see where it's kind of falling into the ground.
Oh, and it's sinking into a swamp or something at the end. It's so good. Yeah, I think there is something about these films that is eerie. They're not as overtly sort of gory as Hammer films, for example, right? And they don't have those kind of... there's a great moment in Pit and the Pendulum, actually, with a body in a coffin that's a kind of jump scare. But other than that, they don't have a lot of those traditional scares. But it's more in the kind of ideas of them. I guess it's that Poe thing of just the idea of being buried alive, for example, is so many people's worst fear, right? Or this idea of, or the Pit and the Pendulum, obviously the final sequence in that, these kind of long, prolonged, protracted death scenes, slow, conscious death, right, that you get in both these movies. That I think that's something that's really interesting about them, is that they're scarier in their ideas, I suppose, in the kind of concept more than anything else,
And I feel like in that way, we were talking about these movies inspiring Bava, and I feel like if we're talking about it inspiring Italian cinema, I feel like it's almost closer to all those Barbara Steele movies that she made that were kind of independent. The Castle of Blood, Nightmare Castle, The Long Hair of Death, those kinds of kind of not really plot driven, but also let's walk around the castle and we know something spooky is going on in there. And that seems more like the descendant of these types of movies, even though weirdly I think they're all black and white.
Right, there you go. That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Well, there you go. Is there there's probably more ground we can cover when we talk about the Pit and the Pendulum as well. But is there anything else you want to mention? Any other kind of highlights from this movie before we move on?
I don't think so. Maybe just we haven't perhaps given enough praise to Corman for seeing the wisdom in, instead of making it. I think the choice he was given was. He was making a lot of movies he would shoot in 10 days and he would make them in black and white. And he kind of saw that was going nowhere. And he pitched to his producers the idea of combining two into one, like the budget of two of them into one, and making it in CinemaScope and making it in color and shooting over 15 days. And that's kind of what created his brand, is the fact that he made this movie, it was bigger and it was in color, which was a huge deal at the time.
Yeah.
And it revolutionized things a little bit. And I think that it was a big hit, and that's what allowed him to go on and keep making the Poe movies and then move on to be a producer for many other things.
Amazing. What a talented man he is, right? Incredible. So there you go. So that is House of Usher, and we might come back to a few of these points when we talk about the next film too, because they are very similar. So we're going to go to 1 year later, to 1961, to The Pit and the Pendulum.
You are about to enter hell, Bartolome. Hell! The netherworld. the infernal regions, the abode of the damned, the place of torment, pandemonium, Abaddon, Tophet, Gehenna, Naraka, the pit, and the pendulum.
Axelle, what's the story of the pit and the pendulum?
So our normie goes to Vincent Price's castle to investigate the death of his sister.
Mm-hmm.
And at first he's told that she died of a bizarre blood disorder because of course. And then he realizes that she actually died of fright. And her ghost seems to haunt the house. Then there's also a moment we learn that Price's father was an inquisitor who would torture people and whose wife was prematurely buried, and that therefore Poe's character has a terrible fear of premature burial.
Yes.
And could it be that the sister suffered the same fate?
Excellent synopsis, Axelle.
Put me out of my misery.
No, you did. That was very, very good and different enough to the previous one. I love it. So, Axelle, what do you think of The Pit and the Pendulum? How does it compare to House of Usher for you?
It's really fun. I kind of like this one better, which is funny because they're really of a piece and they're very much... So Pit and the Pendulum, the story that it's based on, and I should have put that in my synopsis because that's kind of the centerpiece of it all, but it also gives away the entire third act.
Yes.
The story
the title is a spoiler.
Yes, very much.
Yeah.
But it's entirely based in there's basically one location. And it's that classic kind of man wakes up, doesn't know where he is. He's been condemned to, I think we know in the beginning, if I remember well, we know that the Inquisition is sending him to be tortured. And so he wakes up a dark place and he can't see where he is, and then he falls asleep again and realizes if he'd kept walking to explore the room he would have fallen into a pit. And then when he wakes up again, he's in a different room and there's a pendulum swinging over him that's about to cut him into pieces. And so everything is just that atmosphere of where am I, what's going on, the torture of it all. And it's really interesting because in some ways it's soft.
Yes.
It's cute. It's those movies where a bunch of strangers wake up in the room and don't know how they got there, and they're going to be weirdly tortured in that room. And it's exactly that. And so there's not much to the story of it. And I guess what they did is, you know what? House of Usher was a big success. How about we make House of Usher, but at the end there's a Pit in the Pendulum.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit that. It's kind of,
Yeah. It's true. I prefer this one too, actually, weirdly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that final act is so cool. Like, the actual pendulum and pit sequence is brilliant, I think, and scary, like genuinely horrible. And you're right, I thought of Saw too. I think there is actually one of the Saw sequels that literally has the kind of swinging blade, the kind of pit and the pendulum style blade coming down. But also there's that... There's almost that kind of like Martyrs-esque, the hidden torture chamber under the house kind of thing as well, right? It's kind of interesting.
Which they hint at the beginning when they introduced Price, and I love that. And he's like, there's a weird engine noise behind, and I was like, oh yes, this engine that needs to constantly move. It's a nice little bit of foreshadowing. It's really, why did he keep his father's torture chamber active? There's a whole backstory to that we haven't heard. That would be really interesting.
Well, that's the thing. I always have questions, but it's got one of those fun kind of plots too, where I've seen this film about 4 times now, and almost every time I kind of forget that there's this whole sort of twist where Barbara Steele is alive and she's having an affair with his best friend, and she's been pretending to be dead because they've been trying to drive him mad, and then he kind of goes mad and becomes his dad. Yes, it's diabolique. Yes,
it's diabolique, but twisted in the opposite direction. And I kind of love that. I think it's great. I think
too.
I love those twists, and I love the ending. I love that the mother. We thought that Price's mother died in the Iron Maiden, but she didn't.
Yeah.
And then Barbara Steele is put in the Iron Maiden, and then there's that kind of nice ending where everything is, they leave the room, the torture chamber, and they're like, no one will ever enter this room again. And we just slam to Barbara Steele's crazy eyes inside the Iron Maiden, who will be locked in that tomb forever. It's so fun. It's such a great little last image. very
so
haunting.
Good. It is, isn't it? It is. Yeah. So let's talk about Vincent Price again in this one. You know, what do you think of his character in this one compared to Roderick Usher? You know, he looks a little bit more typical Vincent Price in this
He
role,
does,
doesn't
yes.
he? Yeah.
So automatically he has my sympathy. I love him. Very, very similar to Usher.
Yes.
And I really like that he seems to be kind of a villain. And when you know about the torture chamber, or when you kind of know that the father was, you can hint at the fact that he's going to turn villainous at some point, but he's actually quite sympathetic.
Yes.
Where he's kept quite sympathetic because he's the victim of this plot.
Exactly. And then it's just that switch that he does at the end, and it's really fun because you get to see those two sides of Vincent Price, right? The kind of like very kind of like nervous, energy sensitive man, and then you get the really evil, but with that kind of hilarious kind of smile, that twinkle in his eye, Vincent Price at the end there when he goes full Sebastian Medina.
He falls apart because of the suspicion that she was buried alive, and he seems to have gone crazy, and then they go, oh, his mind broke, and he's like, not so fast, bitch.
Yeah.
This is great.
It's so good. And all the backstory, like you said, like the weird flashbacks that Corman puts into this as well. Kind of, you're right, like they don't quite feel as effective in that kind of creepy, queasy, dreamy way as in House of Usher, do they, these sequences? But they don't. They serve the narrative, I guess.
They do, but they have the issue that they're a little bit too complicated, I think. Because even within the backstory, there's twists upon twists, which is really fun, but if that's the moment you decide to go get a glass of milk, like you're missing them. You come back and you're like, what? She was what? And actually they base his fear of premature burial is entirely based on that little moment. So you won't fully understand why he's reacting the way he is if you miss that backstory. Yes. It's so fun and twisted. And there's some Bela Lugosi movies in the 30s, like some of those cheapy movies that he made, which have all the tropes in the same 55 minutes. You know, like the dead bride and the corpse has been stolen by the mad scientist who's building it into an army of... And it feels a little bit like that here, where you have every trope and every cliche and every obsession of Poe. And I'm saying trope and cliche, it sounds very negative, but I actually mean that in the most endearing way. Yeah. But every Poe obsession thrown into the same mix, into this absolutely insane story, and I love it. And at the same time, it is fairly simple because you're just waiting for that third act. You're just waiting for the pit and the pendulum, really.
Yeah, no, you're right. That kind of 80. But another thing about both these movies we didn't mention, but 80 minutes, right, as well. They just fly by as well, you know, in that regard. Like they are kind of beautifully simple in that regard. And this one particularly, I think, because there's quite a lot of plot elements and characters, it moves along a bit faster, actually, for me, this one, than House of Usher does as well. Like
I think so too.
I rewatched it just today, and I was like, oh wow, we're already at that moment where the twist happens and Vincent Price switches. You know, we're already at the final act. It felt like it sort of came really quickly because I was really enjoying it, you know, as well. What about the house itself? You know, like again, a lot of quite long sequences in this film of just kind of people creeping around with candles, going down corridors, discovering hidden rooms and all of that kind of thing.
I find this one a little bit more, but maybe that's just because I'm more into the story itself. I'm not sure. I would have to compare, but I feel like it's a little bit moodier in the way it's lit.
Yes.
And that I like that quite a bit. And it also it's if you take Usher as stage 1 of the house that he builds to film into every time, this is stage 2, so it's already a little bit. It looks amazing. It's just so great, amazing. And it brings like the old castle, the cobwebs, the thunder and lightning, the heightened emotions. Like everything is so theatrical and so. I love it.
Yeah, I love it.
It's a little bit a little bit Scooby-Doo, but in the best way.
Yeah, agreed. Particularly that moment when they open the coffin and they find what they think is the body of, and it's kind of like screaming, like it's been, buried alive. Love all of that stuff. It's so good. People have actually talked about that. I think Stephen King talked about that as like one of his like favorite scares and, such an important horror moment.
Oh, wow.
And, and that's the thing. I think this movie, I think was the most financially successful of all of the Corman Poe adaptations. And, reportedly really terrified audiences at the time as well, really, really scared people, great. Which is great, isn't it? And it's got those kind of creepy moments for sure. And Barbara Steele, let's quickly talk about Barbara Steele. You've mentioned her already.
She's very underused.
Oh, she is underused as well. It's almost like a cameo initially, until you get a bit more of her at the very, very end. But what do you think of her? Just generally, what I love about her is that she's like this kind of very modern kind of sexy actress, but at the same time she's got this kind of like ghostliness that she does so well in films like Black Sunday and this,
And she very often plays dual roles where she's both the victim and the seductress and the villainess. And she plays both beautifully. And here again, she's supposed to be the victim of the entire thing, and she has that fragility when you look at her. But then she also, when she turns it on, when those big eyes kind of go dark, you know you're in for trouble, because she can look fairly terrifying. Yeah. I mean, I love her. I think that she should be a much bigger name and icon in horror. We always talk about the guys, but I feel like Ingrid Pitt and Barbara Steele very much, they've maybe, at least in the case of Ingrid Pitt, worked a few more movies, but they've made such a huge impression. And they also had that kind of quality of enjoying what they're doing.
Yes.
They're clearly, I don't get the sense that Barbara Steele was like, another horror? No, she looked like she really relished it. And if she didn't, she put on a good show, because it's just, she's so fun to watch. But yeah, she's very underused here. But the few moments that we see her, and especially that last moment where, I don't think that moment would have worked as well with someone who didn't have those big terrified eyes that she opens at the end of The Iron Maiden.
Agreed.
She really makes that ending.
Agreed. She's got for somebody who's in relatively few films, she's so memorable in everything she's in, and I think because she has such a distinctive look, she's such a good physical performer, right, as well. I think there's something about her, you're right, it's those eyes as well, and just everything, we all can remember her in films like Black Sunday, and it's that face, isn't it, and everything, and just the way she kind of moves, and she almost kind of glides around, I feel like, as well. You know? She's so good.
And her presence, it just feels like sometimes she looks like this frail woman, but sometimes she looks like she's 6 feet tall.
Yes.
She just looks like she's so impressive, and you don't want to be on her bad side for sure. And I just love that it's always mixing those two sides of her, and she's always kind of a little bit of both. You thought she was a villain, but she's actually a good person. You thought she was a great person, and she's a victim, but she's actually kind of the evil presence behind it all.
So good. And more great paintings in this film as well, because I think the first time we see her is that painting on the wall of her as well.
With the big eyes. It looks like it's in Burton movie.
Yeah, it does. It's literally big eyes. Yeah, it's great. Very, very cool. Well, there you go. Anything else you want to mention about this movie before we wrap up? I mean, what about Corman's filmmaking itself? It's only been a year. It's only his next film, but is there anything like majorly different? Have you seen in any way any kind of evolution there in kind of Corman's filmmaking?
Stupidly, I watched them in the wrong order when I rewatched them right now, and so it didn't strike me quite as much. But I did make notes that were, there's not a shot that's static, or if it is, it's really very specifically to a purpose. There's moments where I think it's either in this one or in Usher, but there's a moment that I really like where we whip to Vincent Price. We're on the bed seeing, I think it's in Usher actually, where we see the his sister and the fiance and they're kind of talking, planning, and then there's a quick kind of camera whip to Vincent Price walking in, and the way that he reveals him kind of always jumping from a corner of a frame, where there's something very playful about the way that he films everything. And I love that we mentioned that the chandelier sequence, there's so many cool angles that he thinks of, and that just evolves. When you look at Mask of the Red Death, it's the same kind of thing. Like further on in his filmmaking, he just keeps the camera moving. He keeps those wide angles to make the sets look really big. I don't know how big the sets really were, but you get the feeling that you're constantly in this huge castle, that the rooms are massive, but he's always using those wide angle lenses. It's very much my shit. Like, I love that.
So good, isn't it? And actually, just to quickly mention as well, I feel like we should say a bit more about that final Pit and the Pendulum sequence as well, because it is such an iconic moment, isn't it? And I remember I saw this film probably for the first time about 10 years ago, but I remember I'd already seen clips of that sequence, like it was always in those kind of scariest or greatest horror moments kind of sequences. But it really does still hold up, I think, in terms of how long it's so protracted, isn't it? It takes a long time. And again, the weird visual choices, the weird lighting of that thing as it's swinging back and forth, and the extreme close-ups on John Carr's eyes. Apparently it was a real blade as well. Like, I was reading that at first they tried to use a kind of rubberized blade, but it kept getting stuck on the actor's chest, and so they switched it to a sharp metallized blade, but they had to get it in exactly the right position, and then they had to put a steel band around the actor's waist to protect him. But I think, Roger Corman I
think they had both. I think he said that they had like a big steel one that was extremely heavy when it was further up and not close to the actor, but still you're hanging this massive. That must have been nice. I'm glad they didn't have to deal with insurance. Is the way that we do nowadays. But and then that he had the rubber one when it got a little bit closer, and in close-ups he would use the steel one. And there was a fake body of the victim who he said looks extremely realistic, but I have my doubts, although I can't say that I've spotted it. I didn't really pay attention, but anytime someone in the 60s says, you couldn't tell the difference between the fake body and the, like, yeah, buddy, for sure. But yeah, it's really nicely. It's also really impressive that this set looks so fantastic, even though I think that probably all they built was like a wall and a little bit of the platform on which the weird contraption is built, and everything else is a matte painting. And you only ever see it in that kind of super wide shot that he goes back to a couple of times. But the painting is just so great. Like, it looks like it's in the middle of, I don't know, what are we supposed to understand? That it's like there's a cave all around it?
Yeah, it's like a huge cavernous space, isn't it? And you're right, like, they always choose to go these kind of extreme wide shots, and yeah, it's just like this giant, it's like something out of Lord of the Rings. It's like this huge staircase going up, isn't it? Yeah, it's brilliant.
Like, if I understand it well, in the Poe story, the pit is in the middle of the room, and they're just waiting for him to kind of stumble in the dark and fall in the pit, which he doesn't do. And here it seems like the platform with the pendulum is in the center, and then everything around it is the pit that he's never going to fall into because he's about to get cut by a pendulum anyway.
Yeah.
But I guess that's the idea, right? Is that it's in the middle of of that pit.
It's a really great set piece in this. Like, it's unbeaten, I think. I really love this sequence, and it is, you're right, like, I think this film feels like it's got that momentum where you're just hurtling towards that scene, don't you, throughout the whole thing. But it still feels worth it by the time you get to it, I think,
And I feel like, going back to what we were saying about Christopher Lee being scary and Price never being particularly terrifying, I would argue that if you have to find a scene where Vincent Price is actually kind of scary, it's probably this one. Because the way he shifts from being that frail person who is about to see his mind break to suddenly being this guy who's just like, you're going to pay for what you did to me. And he's dressed in this weird outfit, and he just looks demented. And and that sense of fun is almost gone from that. He seems very driven, and the contrast between the two is really well played, I feel.
So true. And also the performance of John Carr while he's strapped and bound and gagged in that, you can see him literally, and apparently it was real, the actor was really perspiring and sweating as well.
Sweating.
But the actual cuts between the two of them work so well, I think, as well, Yeah. Really, really lovely. Well, there you go. That's The Pit and the Pendulum. So much fun. How do you think, both these films now are over 60 years old, right? But do you think they still hold up when you sort of rewatched them this week? How did you find them?
I love them. I feel they're a huge part of who I am as a horror fan, as a filmmaker, as just someone who has an appreciation for set design. And I will say, though, that when I first watched them when I was a teenager, or maybe a little younger, when I finally got to actually see them, I found them dull as dishwater.
Interesting.
I loved them, on the one hand, because I loved Vincent Price and I loved the imagery. But sitting through them, I felt like they were very long and not as shocking as I was hoping.
Yeah.
So if you're 35 listening to this podcast and haven't watched them, by all means, go and watch them and have fun, because you probably have enough understanding of the genre and enough awareness of what to expect that you're going to have a blast. Watching it now, I think they're great. I adore them. But if you're 15 listening to this podcast and you're looking for some thrills, again, watch them, but know that the pacing is not what to expect today. It's the same thing we were talking about with the Bela Lugosi movies. Yes, they're wonderful and they have fantastic moments and visual imagery that's striking and has defined the genre, but also know what you're getting into, and it's not the same cinematic language that we use today.
Perfectly put. Yeah, completely agree. There you go. Well, Axelle, thank you so much for joining me. As ever, it's been such a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. And until next time, just let people know where they can come and find you. Is there anything that you've got coming up that people should keep a lookout for? I'm
on Instagram, Axelle Carolyn. I have 2 episodes of another TV show. I just did 2 episodes of Mayfair Witches, which aired in the US, but I'm not sure it aired in the UK just yet.
No.
So it's the adaptation of Anne Rice's Mayfair Witches. I did episode 3 and 4, and then later in the year, I'll have 2 episodes and season 2 of the Prime show Them, which was, I think season 1 was 2 years ago, and it's you'll see when it comes out, but it's probably going to be more, I would assume, towards Halloween.
Love it. I can't wait. Well, thank you so much, Axelle. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun. Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to both my brilliant, very knowledgeable guests, Axelle Carolyn and Adam Robinson. What a fun week. I loved discussing Edgar Allan Poe and these 2 brilliant movies. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. If you want to keep up to date with any upcoming events, we've got so many fun screening events coming up over the next few weeks. Head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events. If you want to support this podcast financially and get treated to regular bonus content, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast platforms, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay then, on to next week. Oh my god, I'm so excited about next week. So, next week, we finally move into some proper home invasion. These are actual modern homes being invaded. In fact, that's kind of it for the fun, safe, warm blanket horror movies, because as of next week onwards, as we move into the mid-60s, things in this subgenre get nastier. But next week, it's a real fun double bill. I am going to be joined by Gaylords of Darkness co-host Stacey Ponder to discuss Lady in a Cage from 1964 and Wait Until Dark from 1968. Things are about to get scary. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.